Think of the grandest structures from the ancient world, the soaring Gothic cathedrals with their stained glass that seems to catch fire in the sunlight, the sprawling Roman aqueducts that carried water across mountains, the delicate silk robes that traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road. Now ask yourself this: who actually built them? Not the kings who took credit, not the generals who won battles, but the nameless, faceless craftsmen whose hands turned raw materials into marvels. These were the inventors, the problem solvers, the artists whose skills were so essential that entire civilizations rose on their backs, and yet today we barely remember they existed. That changes right now. Picture this: a medieval alchemist hunched over a smoky furnace, not chasing fairy tales of turning lead into gold, but carefully recording the reactions of chemicals, laying the groundwork for modern chemistry. Or a parchment maker painstakingly scraping animal hides so thin they could hold ink without bleeding, ensuring that the words of philosophers and scientists survived the centuries. These weren't just jobs, they were quiet revolutions. Every stitch in a tapestry, every nail forged in a blacksmith's fire, every barrel crafted by a cooper, each was a silent act of genius that held kingdoms together. So why did history forget them? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. Because when we dig beneath the stories of emperors and conquerors, we find something far more fascinating: the ordinary people who did the extraordinary. The ones who mixed the mortar for castle walls, who distilled the first medicines, who wove the sails that carried explorers to new worlds. Their tools might seem primitive now, but their ingenuity was anything but. And their legacy, it's all around us, hidden in plain sight. So let's pull back the curtain on the 24 forgotten professions that built the ancient world, and meet the unsung heroes who shaped history without ever making it into the history books. Trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at the past or the present the same way again. History has a funny way of remembering the loudest voices while the whispers fade. The kings who waged wars, the philosophers who debated ideas, the artists who painted masterpieces. But what about the hands that ground their pigments, the backs that carried their stones, the minds that solved the 1,000 tiny problems standing between an idea and its reality? The truth is, the decline of these forgotten professions wasn't accidental. It was a slow erasure, layer by layer, as the spotlight of history narrowed to focus only on those at the top. Take the humble fuller, for example, a trade so vital in medieval Europe that entire towns revolved around their workshops. These were the chemists of their day, using urine and clay to cleanse and thicken woolen cloth, turning rough fabric into something soft enough to wear against the skin. Disgusting, maybe; essential, absolutely. But when industrialization brought mechanized looms and synthetic detergents, the fuller's art vanished almost overnight, relegated to footnotes in old guild records. The same fate awaited the bowires who carved arrows with deadly precision, the illuminators who turned manuscripts into jeweled light, the millers who kept famine at bay. One technological leap, and their skills became relics. Yet there's another reason these professions disappeared from memory. They were ordinary. Chroniclers rarely wrote about the woman who stitched a queen's gown or the man who mixed mortar for a cathedral's foundation. Why would they? These tasks were simply part of life's fabric, invisible until they were gone. But here's the twist: when we ignore these roles, we don't just lose names. We lose the very texture of history. A castle isn't just a king's ambition. It's the sweat of quarrymen who knew which stones wouldn't crack, the cunning of carpenters who fitted beams without nails, the patience of glaziers who spun molten sand into windows. Without them, the past flattens into a story of crowns and conquests, missing the marrow that made it all possible, and that's why uncovering these trades matters. Every time we rediscover a forgotten craft, we're piecing together a fuller, richer portrait of how people actually lived, how they solved problems, celebrated beauty, and built worlds with nothing but their hands and wit. So let's turn the page, starting with a profession so foundational, its absence would have collapsed empires, the humble, ingenious water-bearer. In the dim glow of candlelit workshops, where the scent of sulfur and crushed herbs clung to the air, the alchemist was far more than a mystic chasing fool's gold. These were the original problem solvers, the ones who turned raw earth into medicine, who coaxed color from dull minerals, who unlocked the secrets of transformation centuries before modern labs existed. Take something as simple as kohl, the dark eyeliner used in ancient Egypt. It wasn't just for beauty. Alchemists perfected its formula to protect eyes from the harsh desert sun and infections, blending galena and oils with precision. Their work was science disguised as magic, a dance of trial and error that gave us everything from vivid dyes for royal tapestries to the first rudimentary glassware. And then there's gunpowder, stumbled upon by Chinese alchemists seeking an elixir of immortality. Imagine their shock when their experiments erupted into flashes of light and smoke, a discovery that would reshape warfare, mining, and even celebrations. But their legacy isn't just in explosions. These pioneers documented every reaction, every failure, in cryptic manuscripts that later chemists would decode like treasure maps. Without their meticulous notes on distillation, fermentation, and metal purification, we might not have the antibiotics, alloys, or even the stained glass windows that define medieval cathedrals. Yet history often paints them as charlatans, their labs as dens of delusion. Why? Because their language was poetry, their methods wrapped in symbolism. When an alchemist wrote of the green lion devouring the sun, they weren't spinning fairy tales. They were describing the chemical reaction of sulfuric acid dissolving gold. Their coded language protected trade secrets, but it also obscured their brilliance from later generations. But here's what's truly astonishing. Many of their techniques still linger in plain sight. The next time you admire the ruby red glaze on a medieval vase or take an aspirin for a headache, you're touching the unbroken thread of their craft. Their workshops were the first pharmacies, their crucibles the birthplaces of metallurgy. And while we've replaced their alembics with sterile labs, we're still answering the questions they dared to ask centuries ago. How can we transform the ordinary into the extraordinary? Now, let's step away from the smoky glow of the alchemist's furnace and into the streets where another group of forgotten professionals fought a battle just as vital, one that determined whether a city thrived or collapsed under its own filth. While alchemists worked their magic in secret chambers, another group toiled in the foulest corners of medieval cities, the Gong farmers. Imagine the stench of a world without sewers, where chamber pots emptied into streets and cesspits festered beneath floorboards. These were the unsung heroes who plunged into that darkness, shoveling human waste into carts under cover of night, their faces wrapped in cloth against the choking fumes. Revolting, undoubtedly, but here's the twist. Their grim work saved more lives than most physicians of the era. A single overflowing cesspit could poison a town's water supply, spreading dysentery and cholera like wildfire. Gong farmers didn't just clean, they were medieval sanitation engineers, hauling waste beyond city walls to be composted into fertilizer, completing a cycle that kept crops growing and hunger at bay. Their guilds even had strict rules. Some worked only after curfew, others wore distinctive badges so townsfolk could avoid them by day. Yet without them, cities like London or Paris would have drowned in their own filth. But why does history barely whisper their names? Because filth was invisible until it killed you. Chroniclers wrote of plague doctors in their beaked masks, but who praised the laborer who prevented the plague by carting off the waste that bred its rats. Gong farmers were the ultimate paradox, essential yet despised, their work foundational to civilization's survival, yet considered too vulgar to record. And that's the real tragedy. When we ignore these reviled professions, we miss a stark truth. Progress isn't just about gleaming inventions or grand battles. Sometimes it's about the back-breaking, thankless tasks that keep society from crumbling. The next time you flip a light switch, think of the Gong farmers' modern cousins, the wastewater technicians and trash collectors still doing the dirty work that lets our world shine. Now, let's leave the shadows of the cesspit for a profession that literally lit up the ancient world, one that turned fire into artistry and darkness into spectacle. The torchbearers of progress weren't just carrying flames, they were weaving the first threads of public safety and nighttime commerce, one flickering light at a time. As dusk settled over cobblestone streets and the last rays of sunlight vanished behind rooftops, a lone figure moved through the gathering shadows with a long pole in hand, the lamp lighter. This wasn't just a job, it was a nightly ritual that transformed danger into safety, isolation into community. Imagine a world where darkness wasn't pierced by the flick of a switch, but by the steady climb of a man balancing on a ladder, lighting oil lamp after oil lamp, each flame pushing back the night just a little further. These unsung heroes worked in silence, their footsteps echoing through empty lanes as they navigated precarious perches and biting winds. A single mist lamp could mean a mugging in an alley or a cart overturning in the gloom. But their impact went beyond safety. With each light they ignited, they extended the day for merchants haggling over late shipments, for scholars bending over books, for neighbors sharing stories on doorsteps. The glow of those lamps didn't just illuminate streets, it sparked the first embers of nightlife, of cities that thrived beyond sunset. Then came the gas lamp, and with it, the slow fade of the lamplighter's trade. No more ladders, no more oil-smudged hands, just the hiss of automated flames. Yet we owe these forgotten workers more than nostalgia. Their nightly rounds laid the groundwork for modern street lighting, for the idea that public safety shouldn't end when the sun dips below the horizon. Today, when we stroll down a well-lit boulevard or admire the skyline of a city gleaming after dark, we're walking in the light they first kindled, one lamp at a time. Now, let's turn from the flickering glow of street lamps to the vibrant hues of another forgotten craft. The dyers who turned plain cloth into treasures, whose vats of bubbling color dressed emperors and commoners alike in the brilliance of the ancient world. Step into a medieval fuller's workshop, and the first thing that would hit you wasn't the sight, it was the smell. Ammonia from stale urine, the earthy tang of clay, the damp wool steaming in the air. This wasn't just a laundry service, it was a chemical laboratory where raw fleece became something sturdy enough to armor a knight or catch the wind on a ship's sail. Fullers didn't just clean cloth, they transformed it, stomping through vats like winemakers crushing grapes, their bare feet kneading the fibers tighter with every step. The urine, a natural degreaser, breaking down oils trapped in the wool. The clay, a binder, thickening the fabric until it could hold its shape for decades. Think of the Viking longships that crossed icy seas, their sails stiff with salt spray. Those sails were fulled. The vibrant tapestries that warmed castle walls, the monk's rough habit that survived years of wear, all passed through a fuller's hands. Their craft was so vital that fulleries became hubs of industry, often built near rivers where water wheels powered massive wooden hammers to pound cloth faster than human feet ever could. In places like medieval Florence, fullers formed powerful guilds, their trade secrets guarded as closely as a banker's ledgers, yet history rarely paints them as innovators. Why? Because their work was dirty, literally. Chroniclers wrote of weavers and tailors, but who celebrated the laborers shin deep in vats of piss. But here's what they missed. Fullers were early chemists, manipulating natural reactions long before anyone understood molecular bonds. When a Roman senator's toga resisted stains or a peasant's cloak shed rain, it wasn't magic, it was the fuller's art. And then, like so many forgotten trades, their craft vanished with industrialization. Chemical detergents replaced urine, mechanical presses made foot trampling obsolete. But next time you pull on a pair of jeans stiff with starch, remember, you're wearing the legacy of those maligned, sharp-smelling workshops. Now, let's turn from the vats of the fuller to the quiet tables of the scribe's silent partners, the ones who made sure every stroke of ink stayed crisp and clear on the page. In the dim light of a medieval scriptorium, where the air smelled of wood smoke and drying ink, the parchment scraper worked with a blade so sharp it could shave the thinnest layer of skin, literally. This wasn't just a preparation job, it was an act of resurrection. Imagine a world where every book, every royal decree, every map began as the hide of a sheep or goat, still stiff with dirt and bristling with hair. The scraper's task, to turn that raw skin into something smooth enough to hold the stroke of a quill without bleeding, durable enough to survive centuries. They started by soaking the hides in lime baths to loosen hair, then stretched them on wooden frames like drumheads. With curved knives, they scraped away every follicle, every imperfection, sometimes thinning the skin to near transparency. A single mistake, a nick or uneven patch, could ruin weeks of work. The finest parchment, called uterine vellum, came from unborn calves, so delicate it could fold like silk yet strong enough to outlast stone. But here's what's astonishing. These unsung artisans didn't just make writing possible, they shaped how knowledge spread. A well-scraped page could hold ink without smudging, allowing scribes to cram more text into precious manuscripts. The Magna Carta, the illuminated Gospels, even Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, all depended on the scraper's invisible skill. And when libraries burned or wars raged, it was their handiwork that kept words alive in the ashes. Yet history barely mentions them. Why? Because their craft lived in the margins, quite literally. While scribes were celebrated for their elegant lettering, no one praised the hands that prepared their canvas. But next time you see a photograph of an ancient manuscript, remember, the true magic isn't just in the words, but in the blankness that made them possible. Now, let's leave the quiet world of parchment behind for a profession that filled the ancient air with sound: the bellcasters, whose molten artistry turned metal into music, marking time and tragedy across generations. Deep beneath the towering spires of medieval cathedrals, in workshops filled with the acrid tang of molten metal and burning sand, the bell founder performed a kind of alchemy far more precise than turning lead into gold. Their task: to cast towering bronze bells with notes so pure they could pierce through storms, summoning souls to prayer or warning of fire and invasion. This wasn't just metalwork, it was a science of sound, where a fraction of an inch too much copper or tin meant the difference between a heavenly chime and a dull, lifeless thunk. Picture the process. First, a clay core shaped like the bell's interior, baked hard as stone. Then, a wax model of the bell's outer surface, carved with painstaking precision to control thickness and curvature. The wax was encased in more clay, melted away to leave a hollow mold, a technique called lost wax casting that hadn't changed since antiquity. But the true test came when the founder poured molten bronze, heated to nearly 2,000 degrees, into that fragile mold. Too fast and the mold could crack, too slow and the metal would cool unevenly, warping the bell's voice forever. And what a voice it was! A master founder didn't just cast metal, they composed. The largest bell, the burden, hummed a deep, resonant bass. Medium bells sang the tenor line, while smaller ones danced in soprano arcs. Together, they formed chords that could carry for miles, turning the air itself into an instrument. In an age before clocks, these were the heartbeat of a town, marking births, deaths, and everything in between. The great bell of Notre Dame, Emmanuel, still rings today with the same bronze poured in the 1600s, a testament to founders who understood that their craft wasn't just about noise, but about shaping time itself. Yet history often treats them as anonymous tradesmen. Why? Because their greatest works were meant to be heard, not seen. While architects signed their cathedrals and painters initialed their altarpieces, the founder's signature was a tone so perfect it seemed to come from heaven. And when industrialization brought cheaper, machine-made bells, their art nearly vanished, replaced by steel cylinders that clanged rather than sang. But next time you hear a church bell toll in the distance, listen closely. That sound carries more than a call to worship. It's the echo of 1,000 years of human ingenuity, a reminder that even in the ancient world, science and art were never truly separate. Now, let's turn from the thunder of bells to the whisper of another forgotten craft, one that measured the hours not with sound, but with shadows, water, and the patient turning of the stars. In the hushed halls of ancient courts and sunlit temple courtyards, time didn't tick, it dripped. The water clock maker's craft was a marriage of precision and poetry, where the steady fall of liquid marked the passage of hours long before gears and pendulums took over. Picture a vessel of carved stone or bronze, filled to the brim, its tiny outlet calibrated so carefully that each drop represented a heartbeat of the day. But these weren't just simple buckets with holes. Some designs spanned entire walls, with floating indicators tracking the water's descent, while others chimed bells or triggered mechanical birds to sing at appointed intervals. The genius of these forgotten engineers lay in their understanding of balance. A water clock in Alexandria, designed by the inventor Ctesibius, used a complex system of gears and floats to account for changes in flow rate, anticipating problems modern clocks wouldn't face for centuries. In China, imperial water clocks stretched multiple stories high, their cascading reservoirs powering synchronized puppets that acted out scenes from mythology. Even the ancient Greeks used them to time speeches in courts, ensuring no orator rambled beyond his allotted span. Yet for all their sophistication, water clocks held a fragile magic. A change in temperature could thicken the water's flow. A speck of debris could clog the spout. Maintaining them required constant attention, a ritual as sacred as the time they measured. And when mechanical clocks emerged in medieval Europe with their dependable gears and chimes, the water clock makers' art faded into obscurity, but their legacy. It's in the very language we use. The word clock comes from the Latin clocca, meaning bell, a nod to the chimes these early timekeepers inspired, and the idea that hours could be standardized, divided, and measured precisely. That began with the patience of artisans who understood that time, like water, could be harnessed but never held. Now, let's turn from the quiet drip of timekeeping to a profession that fueled empires, the unsung masters of fire and grain who turned simple flour into the bread that built civilizations. Imagine a biscuit so hard it could crack teeth, yet so durable it could outlast empires, the humble hardtack. These unassuming squares of flour, water, and salt were the unsung fuel of history's greatest expeditions, baked to near indestructibility by masters of preservation. Viking longships stocked them for Atlantic crossings, Roman legions marched on them for months, and Napoleon's armies relied on them to push across Europe. The hardtack baker's craft wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. The secret lay in the baking not once but twice, driving out every trace of moisture that might invite mold or insects. The result, a biscuit that could endure years in a ship's hold, surviving damp, heat, and even rats. Sailors called them molar breakers, softening them in beer or water before eating, while soldiers ground them into porridge when fires were scarce. Some surviving specimens from the Civil War still sit in museums today, looking almost unchanged after a century and a half. But here's what's easily overlooked. These bakers were early chemists, manipulating simple ingredients to defy time itself. Without their knowledge of how to create sterile, anhydrous conditions through heat, entire campaigns would have crumbled from starvation long before reaching battlefields. The hardtack baker's workshop was the original laboratory of food science, a place where necessity turned flour into a time capsule. And then, like so many forgotten trades, their craft faded with the rise of canned goods and refrigeration. Yet their legacy lingers in modern emergency rations and space food, proof that the simplest solutions often outlast the grandest inventions. Now, let's turn from the preservation of food to the preservation of life itself. The healers who fought invisible battles with little more than herbs, observation, and sheer determination. The leech's workshop smelled of dried herbs, boiling vinegar, and something far more unsettling, the damp, metallic scent of bloodletting. These weren't just crude practitioners waving leeches like carnival showmen. They were medieval medicine's frontline thinkers, working with the best knowledge of their age. Picture a healer in a dim, candlelit room, shelves lined with jars of powdered willow bark for pain, moldy bread pressed against wounds to prevent infection, an accidental precursor to penicillin, and yes, bowls of squirming leeches kept ready for balancing the body's humors. To modern eyes, it seems barbaric, but here's what history often misses. These were the first empirical scientists of the body, observing which treatments yielded results and which killed their patients. Take the humble leech itself. Today, we shudder at the thought, but in skilled hands, these creatures were precision tools. Their saliva contains hirudin, a natural anticoagulant that kept blood flowing during surgeries, a substance so effective it's still used in modern microsurgery. Leeches knew exactly where to bite, how much to drain, when to let go, and the leech, they documented everything. A 12th century manual from Salerno details which veins to avoid, how to sterilize blades with flame, even how to suture wounds with silk thread. These weren't blind practitioners, they were cataloging cause and effect centuries before clinical trials existed. Yet their legacy is tangled in paradox. While some leeches prescribed prayers alongside potions, others pioneered techniques we still use. The famed surgeon Abulcasis, working in 10th century Spain, invented over 200 surgical instruments, including forceps and scalpels nearly identical to today's. His illustrated manuals showed how to set bones, remove cataracts, even perform tracheotomies, procedures that wouldn't become standard for another 800 years. But because his work was copied and recopied by anonymous scribes, his name faded while his innovations endured, and that's the real tragedy. We remember the leech jars and the bleeding bowls, but not the meticulous notes that linked clean wounds to faster healing, or the herb gardens where early antibiotics were cultivated by trial and error. When we dismiss these practitioners as quacks, we erase the slow, painful foundation of every modern hospital. Next time you take an aspirin, thank not just the chemist who synthesized it, but the medieval leech who first chewed willow bark and noted its power to ease fever. Now, let's leave the world of medicine for a profession that stitched together something far larger than wounds, the couriers and messengers who wove empires together with nothing but their feet and their wits, carrying words across mountains and rivers long before the first postal stamp was dreamed of. Across deserts, mountains, and war-torn frontiers, the courier was the human thread stitching empires together, one blistering step at a time. Picture a lone runner in the Persian Empire, part of the legendary Angarium relay system, sprinting between stations where fresh horses and messengers waited. These men could cover the 1,600 miles between Susa and Sardis in just 7 days, faster than any mounted rider traveling solo. Their secret: a meticulously organized network of way stations where messages passed like batons in a race against time. A king's decree could outpace plagues, rebellions, even rumors, because speed wasn't just efficiency, it was power. But the courier's world was fraught with peril. Roman tabularii braved alpine blizzards with wax-sealed dispatches strapped to their chests, while Mongol yam riders navigated the Silk Road's bandit-infested stretches, their saddlebags heavy with silk-wrapped edicts from Kublai Khan. One wrong turn, one missed password at a checkpoint, and the message along with its bearer might vanish forever. And yet, their greatest threat wasn't thieves or storms, but something far quieter: the fragility of human memory. Before standardized writing, many couriers memorized entire speeches, treaties, or warnings verbatim, their minds becoming living parchment. The ancient Greeks called them hemerodromoi, day runners, capable of reciting epic poems after days without sleep. What history often overlooks is how these unsung sprinters shaped events we now consider pivotal. When Pheidipides collapsed after running from Marathon to Athens, gasping, "We have won," he wasn't just delivering news, he was etching a moment into legend. The Inca's chasqui runners, stationed every 6 miles across the Andes, could relay a message from Quito to Cusco, over 1,200 miles in under a week, their knotted quipu cords recording everything from troop movements to grain stores. Without them, an empire spanning jungles and peaks would have fractured into isolated fragments. Yet as ink and paper replaced oral tradition, as roads improved and postal systems formalized, the courier's art faded into anonymity. The Pony Express riders of the 1860s, racing for 90 days before the telegraph rendered them obsolete, were the last gasp of a tradition as old as civilization itself. Today, when an email circles the globe in seconds, we've lost something visceral: the weight of a scroll in a saddlebag, the urgency in a runner's panting breath, the knowledge that some words were worth risking lives to carry. Now let's turn from the dust-choked trails of messengers to a profession that shaped not just messages, but the very spaces they moved through, the architects of beauty who turned stone and light into poetry. The mosaicists' workshop was a symphony of shattered brilliance, a place where jagged fragments of stone, glass, and gold were coaxed into stories that could outlast empires. Picture the artist crouched over a wooden frame, fingers blackened with mortar, selecting each tessera not just for its color, but for how it would catch the light at dawn or flicker under candlelight at dusk. These weren't mere decorations, they were optical illusions crafted to breathe life into flat surfaces. A single square foot might contain hundreds of hand-cut tiles, some no larger than a fingernail, each angled precisely to reflect or absorb light. In the great basilicas of Ravenna, Byzantine mosaicists used gold leaf tiles set at slight tilts so the walls seemed to shimmer like living flames, convincing worshippers they stood at the threshold of heaven itself. But the true genius of these forgotten artisans lay in their resourcefulness. When purple dye from Tyre became rarer than gold, they layered red glass over blue to mimic imperial hues. When earthquakes threatened to shake their work apart, they mixed crushed pottery into mortar for flexibility. even their mistakes were masterstrokes, a gap left between tiles to prevent cracking from thermal expansion, a deliberate roughness to keep sandaled feet from slipping on wet floors. The mosaics of Pompeii's Villa of the Mysteries still startle visitors with their depth, the shadowy figures seeming to step out of the walls thanks to subtle gradations in tile color that predate Renaissance chiaroscuro by 1500 years. Yet history often relegates them to footnotes, their names erased while the painters and sculptors they inspired took center stage. Why? Because their medium was collective by nature. A single fresco might bear a painter's signature, but a mosaic was the work of many hand-cutters sorting stone, mixers preparing mortar, apprentices filling background sections while masters tackled faces and hands. And when Gothic cathedrals rose with towering stained glass, the slow, meticulous art of mosaics faded like a neglected pattern in a forgotten corner. But walk into any modern subway station or public square today, and you'll see their legacy reborn in murals of ceramic and glass, the pixelated screens we stare at daily. They're digital descendants of the tessera, proof that the human urge to piece together fragments into meaning never truly disappears. Now, let's turn from the glittering world of mosaics to a craft that shaped history not with color, but with something far more primal, the irresistible aroma of bread drawn fresh from the oven. Before the written word could preserve thoughts in ink, entire civilizations relied on something far more fragile: human memory. Enter the mnemonicist, the living library of antiquity, whose mind could hold epic poems spanning thousands of lines, legal codes thicker than oak trunks, and genealogies branching back generations. These weren't just people with good recall, they were trained professionals who turned memory into a precise science. Picture a medieval bard reciting Beowulf from start to finish without missing a syllable, or a West African griot recounting a royal lineage stretching back centuries, each name and battle placed with pinpoint accuracy. Their techniques would put modern memory champions to shame. Some visualized grand memory palaces, mentally walking through familiar spaces and associating each room with a piece of information. Others used rhythmic patterns, embedding facts into songs or chants that made them impossible to forget. In Iceland, law speakers recited the entire legal code at the annual Althing Assembly, a feat requiring not just rote memorization, but an understanding of how each clause connected to the next. Lose one thread and the entire tapestry of justice could unravel. But here's what's often overlooked: these mnemonicists weren't just human record keepers. They were curators of culture, shaping how stories evolved with every retelling. A single pause or emphasis could change the meaning of a saga. A dropped stanza might erase a hero's deed from history. Their minds were the original algorithms, compressing and retrieving data long before the concept existed. And when writing finally spread, their art didn't vanish, it transformed. Medieval monks used the same techniques to memorize scripture, and even today, actors and musicians rely on methods pioneered by these ancient mental athletes. Now, let's shift from the realms of memory to a profession that required a different kind of precision, one that didn't just preserve order in the mind, but on the streets. The night watchman's call wasn't just a marker of time. It was the thin line between safety and chaos in a world where darkness hid more than just the unknown. The town crier didn't just deliver news, he was the news, a living broadcast tower in a world without headlines or hashtags, clad in a brightly colored coat and often ringing a handbell to silence the crowd. This was the original breaking news alert. Picture a bustling medieval square where merchants haggled, children darted between legs, and the air smelled of roasting chestnuts. Then suddenly, a booming voice cut through the chaos. Oyez. Oyez, hear ye, in the old French still used in courts, With theatrical flair, the crier would announce everything from tax hikes to royal births, his words carrying the weight of law. Miss his message, and you might unknowingly break a new ordinance or miss the chance to sell your wheat before prices dropped. But here's what made them true masters of their craft. They weren't human megaphones. A skilled crier adapted his tone for each audience, somber for a death decree, jubilant for a holiday proclamation, even slyly humorous for local gossip. In an age when most couldn't read, their inflections were the punctuation, turning dry edicts into gripping performances. Some towns even required criers to swear oaths of accuracy, punishing those who garbled messages with fines or public shaming. The role was so trusted that in 17th century England, criers were legally exempt from military service. Their voices were considered vital to civic survival. Yet their decline wasn't just about printing presses or newspapers. It was the loss of something deeper, the communal act of hearing news together, of gasping or cheering in unison. Today, when algorithms tailor headlines to our screens, the town crier's legacy lingers in the paradox of modern media. We have more information than ever, but none of the shared moment that once turned a marketplace into a living, breathing network. Now, let's step into the shadows of justice, where another forgotten profession wielded authority not with words, but with a blade and a steady hand, the executioner, a figure both reviled and essential, whose grim work held up a mirror to society's darkest contradictions. In the hushed solemnity of a medieval courtroom, where the air smelled of wax-sealed parchment and nervous sweat, a defendant's fate often hinged not on evidence but on the voices of strangers. These were the oath helpers, ordinary men and women who stepped forward to swear, hand on scripture or relic, that the accused was truthful. Picture a farmer, calloused hands trembling as he vowed his neighbor's innocence, knowing a false oath could damn his own soul. This wasn't just character testimony, it was a sacred algorithm for justice where reputation weighed heavier than fingerprints or alibis. The system relied on a web of communal trust. An accused person needed a set number of oath helpers, sometimes 12, echoing future jury traditions whose own standing in society lent credibility to their words. A blacksmith with a spotless record might carry more weight than a known drunkard, turning the trial into a calculus of social capital. In some Germanic tribes, the oath helpers even pledged their own property as collateral, a tangible stake in their honesty. Lose the case and they'd forfeit land or livestock alongside the defendant. But here's what's easily misunderstood. Oath helpers weren't just human rubber stamps. Their role required deep knowledge of the accused's life, often spanning years of shared labor, feasts, and conflicts. When a woman accused of theft produced helpers who'd known her since childhood, who could swear she'd never so much as pocketed an apple, their collective word became a shield against suspicion. In an era without forensic science, this was the original background check, where a community's memory served as the ultimate database, yet the system had cracks. Wealthy defendants could buy prestige by recruiting high-status helpers, while the poor might struggle to find enough allies. And when plague or war fractured tight-knit villages, the tradition crumbled under the weight of anonymity. By the late Middle Ages, oath helpers gave way to juries and sworn witnesses systems that prioritized first-hand accounts over character endorsements. But their legacy lingers in modern letters of recommendation, and even credit scores proof that we still outsource trust to networks of reputation, just with less swearing on relics. Now, let's turn from the solemnity of the courtroom to the sun-baked fields where another group of unsung heroes fought a quieter battle not for justice, but for survival itself. The plowmen, sowers, and harvesters who turned stubborn earth into abundance were about to rewrite history with nothing but a handful of seeds and backbreaking patience. In the quiet corners of medieval villages, where the scent of freshly turned earth mingled with the tang of hot metal, the plowright hammered out the tools that fed empires. This wasn't just carpentry or blacksmithing, it was a delicate alchemy of angles and balance. A poorly shaped plowshare could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and a winter of hunger. Picture the wright's workshop, oak beams curing near the forge, iron glowing cherry red on the anvil, and the rhythmic clang of hocks being fitted to wooden frames. Each plow was custom made for the soil. It would break lighter for sandy fields, heavier for dense clay, with curves calculated to slice cleanly without bogging down oxen. The genius of these forgotten artisans lay in their understanding of invisible forces. They knew that a plow's moldboard needed just the right twist to flip soil efficiently, that an iron tip too thick would drag while one too thin would snap under strain. In regions like the Rhineland, plowrights even developed wheeled plows with adjustable depths, revolutionizing agriculture in heavy soils. Their innovations spread silently. No royal decrees celebrated them, no chronicles recorded their names, yet their work allowed populations to boom, turning scrubland into breadbaskets. And then there were the repairs. A broken plow during planting season could doom a family's crops, so wrights often traveled from farm to farm like medieval mechanics, their toolkits filled with spare shares, wedges, and rivets. Some became local legends, their hands said to have a green touch. Plows they mended seemed to yield better harvests, but unlike swordsmiths or armorers, their trade left little glory behind. No one displayed a plow in a castle hall or passed it down as an heirloom. Their masterpieces were worn down by the soil they conquered, then reforged into new blades, their legacy measured in bushels rather than ballads. Now, let's leave the furrowed fields behind for a profession that shaped not the earth, but the soul, the bell founders, whose molten artistry turned metal into music, marking time and eternity with every resonant toll. In the shadowy glow of candlelit workshops, where the scent of molten gold mixed with the earthy tang of cedarwood, the reliquary maker performed a sacred alchemy, transforming precious metals and gemstones into vessels worthy of housing fragments of the divine. These weren't mere boxes or lockets, they were portable miracles designed to inspire awe in the faithful who might never see Jerusalem or Rome. Picture a craftsman hunched over a tiny silver arm, etching veins into the metal with a needle so fine it could scratch prayers onto a grain of rice. Inside this delicate casing, a sliver of bone said to belong to Saint Christopher, or perhaps a thread from the Virgin Mary's cloak. Objects so small they could vanish in a clenched fist, yet powerful enough to draw thousands of pilgrims across continents. The reliquary maker's genius lay in their ability to balance opulence with intimacy. Some designs echoed the body parts they protected, a gilded foot holding a toe bone, a crystal-eyed skull cradling a sliver of cranium, while others took the form of miniature cathedrals, their spires studded with sapphires to mimic stained glass. In Constantinople, artisans employed a technique called niello, filling engraved patterns with black sulfur alloy to make scenes of martyrdom leap from silver surfaces. A reliquary crafted in Limoges might feature champlevé enamel, pooling molten blues and reds into recessed metal like liquid stained glass. Each piece was a theological argument in 3 dimensions, proclaiming that the sacred could be touched, carried, even owned. But here's the twist. These artisans were also early marketing geniuses. When the Bishop of Tours needed to attract pilgrims to his new church in the 6th century, he commissioned a reliquary for St. Martin's cloak that could be opened during festivals, releasing a heavenly fragrance, likely a mix of balsam and incense to dazzle the crowd. The smell, the shine, the sheer theatricality of unveiling a relic, it turned devotion into spectacle, filling church coffers with donations, and the competition was fierce. A reliquary from Cologne might feature a revolving crystal dome so pilgrims could view the relic from all angles, while one from Venice boasted a tiny window that magnified the saint's tooth inside, making it appear larger than life. Yet history often sidelines these craftsmen as anonymous tradesmen, their names lost beneath the saints they enshrined. Why? Because their work existed in the liminal space between art and worship, too sacred to sign yet too practical to romanticize. When the Reformation condemned relics as superstition, thousands of reliquaries were melted down for bullion, their artistry reduced to currency. But next time you see a modern-day souvenir locket or even a museum display case, remember, you're glimpsing the echo of an art form that once convinced entire kingdoms to walk across continents, just for a chance to stand near a speck of dust wrapped in gold. Now, let's turn from the glint of sacred metal to a profession that tantalized a far more earthly sense: the spice grinders, whose mortar and pestle unlocked flavors so exotic they rewrote the map of the world. The sorcerer's workshop smelled of salt, smoke, and patience, a place where time itself was an ingredient. Picture shelves lined with crocks of cabbage fermenting into sauerkraut, barrels of herring packed in brine so thick it stung the eyes, and haunches of venison dangling over smoldering juniper wood. This wasn't just cooking, it was a high-stakes science of survival. A single miscalculation, too little salt in the barrel, too much moisture in the smokehouse, could turn a winter's worth of food into a breeding ground for rot. Yet these unsung artisans wielded their knives and spices with the precision of alchemists, turning perishable bounty into lasting sustenance. Take the humble pickle. What seems like a simple cucumber in vinegar was once a lifeline. Medieval saucers layered vegetables with salt and herbs in stone jars, harnessing natural lacto-fermentation to create a tangy, probiotic-rich food that warded off scurvy during long winters. In Scandinavia, fishermen relied on lutefisk dried cod cured in lye until it swelled into gelatinous, vitamin-packed strips. And let's not forget garum, the Roman Empire's infamous fish sauce, fermented in open vats under the Mediterranean sun until it achieved a umami punch so potent it was shipped in amphorae to garrisons from Britain to Babylon. But the saucer's craft went beyond taste. Smoking wasn't just for flavor. It infused meat with phenols that acted as natural preservatives, while salting drew out moisture to starve bacteria. In the peat bogs of Ireland, families buried butter wrapped in cloth, letting the acidic earth transform it into a crumbly, long-lasting delicacy. These techniques were so vital that guilds guarded them like state secrets. A Venetian saucer could charge a fortune for his method of air-drying prosciutto, just as a German bretter held the keys to perfecting smoked sausages that could last months on a merchant's cart. Yet history rarely credits them for the empires they fueled. How many of Hannibal's soldiers crossed the Alps on smoked goat and hardtack? How many Viking longships reached Newfoundland on barrels of pickled herring? The saucer's art was the silent engine of conquest and trade, turning seasonal gluts into perpetual supply lines. And when industrialization brought canning factories and refrigerated trains, their workshops vanished like morning mist, taking with them the slow, sacred alchemy of preservation by hand. Now, let's step from the smoky haze of the saucer's domain to a profession that didn't just preserve food, but entire landscapes, the terraces that carved mountains into staircases of abundance, reshaping the earth itself to feed civilizations. The siege engineer's workshop was less a place of creation than controlled chaos, a symphony of groaning timbers, hissing ropes, and the metallic tang of freshly forged counterweights. These weren't just builders, they were physicists in an age before the word existed, calculating trajectories with nothing but gut instinct and generations of hard-won experience. Picture a team of carpenters assembling a trebuchet the size of a 3-story house. its throwing arm balanced by a counterweight so massive it took 20 oxen to drag it into place. A single misfire could send that arm snapping backward, crushing its crew in an instant. Yet when it worked, when the engineer gave the signal and the counterweight plunged earthward, sending a 200-pound stone arcing through the air, it could shatter castle walls like porcelain. What set these forgotten geniuses apart wasn't just brute force, but their understanding of psychological warfare. The mangonel, a smaller cousin of the trebuchet, wasn't designed to break stone. It hurled rotting carcasses over walls to spread disease and panic. At the siege of Tyre in 3329 BC, Alexander the Great's engineers built an entire causeway to reach the island city, then deployed siege towers so tall they overshadowed the defenders' walls. And then there were the miners who dug tunnels beneath fortifications only to prop them up with wooden beams, then set the supports ablaze to collapse the ground under their enemies' feet. Every assault was a macabre theater piece with the engineer as its unseen director. Yet for all their destructive power, these artisans were also problem solvers. When Richard the Lionheart's forces struggled to breach the thick walls of Acre during the Third Crusade, his engineers devised the cat, a mobile shed armored with wet hides to protect sappers as they chipped away at the foundations. In Byzantium, defenders mounted giant crossbows called ballistae on their ramparts, capable of skewering 3 men in a single shot. The siege engineer's true weapon wasn't wood or iron, it was ingenuity turned lethal. And then came gunpowder, rendering their painstakingly crafted torsion engines obsolete almost overnight. The same castles that had withstood months of bombardment now crumbled before cannon fire in days. Yet their legacy lingers in modern terms like battery for artillery placements, or the way we still speak of catapulting ideas into public consciousness. The next time you see a medieval castle's shattered keep, remember, those fractures tell the story of minds just as sharp as the swords that followed them. Now let's turn from the architects of destruction to the hands that wove something far more enduring, not walls of stone, but tapestries of influence and intrigue. The weavers of power didn't just make fabric, they spun the very threads that bound societies together. The rope maker's workshop was a place of rhythm and muscle, where bundles of hemp fibers stretched like golden threads across a sunlit yard. This wasn't just twisting strands together, it was a science of tension and torsion, where every braid had to bear the weight of empires. Picture a team of workers walking backward in unison, feeding fibers into a spinning wheel while twisting them into yarns, then combining those yarns into strands, and finally weaving the strands into ropes thick enough to anchor galleons or hoist cathedral stones. The process was mesmerizing, almost dance-like, yet the stakes were deadly. A poorly made rope on a ship's mast could snap in a storm, sending sailors plunging into the sea, while a frayed hangman's noose might prolong an execution into gruesome spectacle. What made these artisans indispensable was their understanding of materials. Hemp, harvested from tall, fibrous plants, was soaked in water to soften the stalks, then beaten to separate the fibers, a process called retting. The best rope makers knew exactly how long to soak the bundles. Too little, and the fibers would be brittle; too much, and they'd rot. In Venice, where the fate of the Maritime Republic depended on rigging that could withstand salt and wind, rope makers worked in the Tonna, a state-owned factory where workers spun threads under strict supervision. The secrets of their craft were so valuable that leaking them could mean imprisonment. But rope wasn't just for ships. Farmers used it to bind sheaves of grain, miners lowered ore buckets with it, and builders suspended scaffolding from it. Even the great bell towers of Europe relied on ropes woven with extra elasticity to absorb the shock of swinging bells. The hangman's rope, often made from stiffened hemp, was deliberately coursed to ensure a quick break of the neck, a grim reminder that this humble material could be an instrument of justice or tyranny. Yet history rarely records their names. While admirals took credit for naval victories and architects signed their towers, the rope maker's art was anonymous, their strands blending into the fabric of daily life. Today, when we tie a knot or pull a cord, we're using technology unchanged for millennia, proof that some innovations are so perfect, they endure in silence. Now, let's step from the sunlit rope walks to the torchlit halls where another group of unsung professionals held sway, not with fibers but with fire and fear. The night watchmen didn't just patrol the streets, they were the living boundary between order and chaos in a world where darkness hid more than just the unknown. The night watchman's call echoed through the cobblestone streets like a metronome of safety, 12 o'clock and all's well. Though well was a generous term in cities where darkness hid cutpurses, drunkards, and worse. Cloaked in thick wool against the chill, armed with nothing but a lantern, a cudgel, and a whistle shrill enough to wake the dead, these men were the original neighborhood watch. Their nightly rounds weren't just about catching criminals. They were a ritual as vital as locking doors or banking fires, a human barrier between order and chaos in an era before streetlights or 911. Picture their routine: testing shop doors for tampering, checking alleyways for vagrants, scanning rooftops for moonlighters, lowering stolen goods on ropes. Some carried rattle watches or wooden noisemakers to summon help, while wealthier towns equipped them with hourglasses to mark shifts. In London, watchmen memorized the faces of local troublemakers, their knowledge of the community's rhythms as sharp as any constable's ledger. A missing shutter, an unfamiliar loiterer, the scent of smoke where none should be, their eyes and ears were the city's first line of defense. But here's what's easily forgotten: watchmen weren't just medieval security guards. They were walking alarm systems, their voices stitching together a patchwork of safety across parishes. In York, they called out the weather along with the hour, helping merchants plan dawn shipments. Venetian watchmen patrolled canals in silent gondolas, listening for the splash of burglars wading through backdoor canals. And in some German towns, they doubled as amateur firefighters, their lanterns swinging toward the first whiff of burning thatch. Yet their reputation was mixed. Drunk or dozing watchmen became stock comedy figures in plays, while others were known to take bribes to forget certain faces in the dark. But when the watch failed, the consequences were dire. The infamous Night of the Long Knives in 1483 saw Milanese assassins slip past drowsy guards to slaughter half the ruling family in their beds, a massacre that reshaped Italian politics for decades. Their decline came with gaslight and professional police, but their legacy lingers in modern neighborhood patrols and even the circadian rhythms of night shift workers. That comforting notion that someone's always awake, keeping watch, it's as ancient as the first city wall. Now, let's leave the flickering lanterns behind for a profession that didn't guard streets, but delighted palates, the confectioners who turned bitter medieval life into something sweeter, one honeyed delicacy at a time. In the gilded halls of medieval banquets, where lords and ladies feasted on roasted peacocks and spiced wine, the true showstopper wasn't the main course, it was the confectioner's masterpiece. Picture a sugar sculpture towering over the table, shaped like a castle with turrets so delicate they trembled in the draught, or a marzipan dragon with almond-scale wings glazed in edible gold. These weren't just desserts, they were edible propaganda, proof that the host could afford the rarest luxury of all, sugar. While peasants subsisted on gruel and honey-sweetened porridge, the elite indulged in candied violets, spiced comfits, and dragees, sugar-coated almonds so prized they were given as dowry gifts. The confectioner's workshop was a laboratory of sweetness where sugar imported at staggering cost from Cyprus or Sicily was melted, pulled, and sculpted like molten glass. Some recipes read like alchemical formulas: rosewater-infused sugar plate kneaded until pliable, then molded into fruit so realistic guests hesitated to bite. Others were outright theatrical, like leechdoms, jellies made from hartshorn deer antler that quivered obscenely on silver spoons, or subtleties, elaborate sugar scenes presented between courses to dazzle diners. At the wedding feast of Henry Roman IV and Joan of Navarre, guests gasped as a sugar replica of the Tower of London emerged, complete with edible prisoners peering through its windows. But here's the twist: these treats weren't just about taste. Sugar was medicine before it was candy. Apothecaries prescribed sugar-coated spices for digestion, and gold-leafed electuaries, a thick pastes of sugar, herbs, and ground pearls as cure-alls for melancholy. The confectioner wasn't just a cook, they were a pharmacist, their sweet wares blurring the line between pleasure and health, yet their craft came at a dark cost. The same Venetian merchants who supplied sugar also trafficked in slaves to harvest it, a grim foreshadowing of the transatlantic trade that would follow. And when the price of sugar finally plummeted in the 1800s, the confectioner's art lost its exclusivity, their once miraculous creations now lining the shelves of every corner shop. Now, let's plunge from the sugar-dusted heights of banquets into the briny depths where another group of unsung professionals battled monsters real and imagined to keep ships and souls afloat. The whalers of the Middle Ages didn't just hunt beasts, they harvested the very lifeblood of pre-industrial Europe, one harpoon thrust at a time. The dike Reeve stood at the muddy edge of a trembling earthwork, his boots sinking into the damp soil as he gauged the tension in the willow-woven fascines beneath his feet. This wasn't just maintenance, it was a high-stakes battle against the sea itself, fought with shovels, sweat, and an intimate knowledge of the tides. In places like the Low Countries, where a third of the land lay below sea level, these unsung engineers didn't just repair barriers. They orchestrated an endless dance between earth and water, turning swamps into some of Europe's most fertile farmland. Picture a chain of villagers passing baskets of sod to reinforce a weakening dike, their hands moving in rhythm like a human conveyor belt against the coming storm. One crack, one missed weak spot, and an entire harvest could vanish under salt water. What set the dike Reeve apart wasn't brute strength, but an almost mystical understanding of hydraulics. They knew that peat soils shrank when drained, requiring constant adjustments to dike heights. They planted reeds along canal banks to slow erosion, designed sluice gates that flushed out silt at low tide, and mapped drainage patterns with nothing but sticks and intuition. In Frisia, Reeves used polars, small clay tiles marked with ownership symbols, to track which farmers maintained which sections of dike, creating an early accountability system. Their rulings carried the force of law: neglect your stretch of barrier and you'd face fines or banishment. After all, survival here was collective. A single lazy farmer could doom an entire village. Yet their greatest innovation was social, not structural. The water boards they oversaw were among history's first democracies, where every landowner, rich or poor, had a vote in flood defense plans. These meetings under open skies, often held on the dikes themselves, laid the groundwork for modern cooperative governance. When the St. Elizabeth's flood of 1421 drowned thousands, it wasn't kings who organized the recovery, but reeves coordinating the rebuilding of hundreds of miles of dikes with painstaking precision. Their legacy now hides in plain sight. The Dutch polders, the lush fields of East Anglia, even the very shape of cities like Amsterdam, all exist because generations of reeves outmaneuvered the ocean with nothing but grit and ingenuity. Today, when engineers deploy satellite-guided dredgers or AI-powered flood models, they're still answering the same question these medieval stewards grappled with: how to draw a line in the sand that the sea will respect. Now, let's step from the sodden edges of reclaimed land to a profession that didn't fight water, but harnessed light: the stained glass artisans who transformed sunlight into scripture, painting with transparency and fire to fill cathedrals with living color. The stained glass artist's workshop was a symphony of fire and patience, a place where sand, ash, and powdered metals fused into sheets of glowing color under the furnace's roar. This wasn't just decoration, it was storytelling in light, a way to make scripture visible to the illiterate masses who gazed up in awe. Picture a master craftsman in Chartres or Canterbury, sketching a scene from the Book of Revelation onto a wooden board, then cutting sheets of ruby red glass with a heated iron to match each curve of an angel's wing. The true magic came next, painting details with a mixture of ground glass and iron oxide, then firing the paint again to fuse the lines permanently. A single misstep, too much heat, a shaky brushstroke could shatter weeks of work. But here's what set these artists apart. They were chemists as much as painters. Cobalt oxide turned glass a celestial blue, gold chloride created a royal crimson, and manganese gave the eerie violet of twilight. In the windows of Sainte-Chapelle, the glass itself became the walls, flooding the space with a jeweled glow so intense visitors swore they'd stepped into heaven's treasury. The artists even exploited the thickness of the glass thinner panes at the top to catch the morning sun, thicker below to deepen the colors as the day waned. Their legacy wasn't just in cathedrals. Stained glass bridged the sacred and the scientific, inspiring later breakthroughs in optics and color theory. Today, when sunlight streams through a modern skyscraper's tinted windows, we're still walking in the light they first harnessed, proof that beauty and ingenuity can outlast even the hardest stone. Now, let's turn from the luminous heights of stained glass to a profession that thrived in the shadows: the crypt keepers, whose silent vigilance guarded not just the dead, but the living secrets of entire civilizations. In the bustling bazaars of Constantinople or the tense negotiation halls along the Silk Road, the dragoman stood at the crossroads of empires, not with a sword but with words. These weren't mere translators, they were human bridges between worlds, passing not just languages but the unspoken nuances of diplomacy and trade. Picture a Venetian merchant sweating under his brocade robes, desperate to sell his wool to an Ottoman buyer, their words bouncing through the dragoman like a game of whispers. A mistranslated price could bankrupt a family, a poorly conveyed compliment might spark a feud. Yet when the dragoman spoke, deals were sealed with handshakes, not hostility, and silks from China found their way to European courts without a single drawn blade. The dragoman's craft went beyond vocabulary. They were masters of cultural algebra, knowing when to soften a sultan's threat into a suggestion or amplify a merchant's offer with poetic flourish. Some memorized entire lexicons of diplomatic niceties, the 47 ways to say, perhaps in Arabic, the exact Persian phrase to imply a bribe without uttering it. In the court of Suleiman the Magnificent, dragomans decoded the secret gestures of foreign ambassadors, their reports shaping treaties that redrew maps. Others accompanied caravans, their tongues as valuable as the spices they carried, smoothing tensions between Mongol horsemen and Persian silk weavers with proverbs tailored to each camp's pride. But here's the twist: their greatest weapon was invisibility. The best dragomans worked like shadows, their presence fading into the background until only the agreement remained. No one praised the interpreter when peace held, only blamed them when it shattered. Yet without them, Marco Polo might never have charmed Kublai Khan. The Treaty of Karlovitz could have collapsed into war, and the very idea of a connected world might have remained a dream. Today, when algorithms instantly translate menus and emails, we've lost something vital: the human instinct to navigate not just words, but the spaces between them. The Dragoman's art reminds us that civilization isn't built on goods or laws alone, but on the fragile, essential act of being understood. Reflections on legacy bring us full circle. These forgotten professions weren't just jobs, they were the hidden gears turning civilization forward. Think of the rope maker's calloused hands weaving fibers that held ships together, or the alchemist's smoky workshop where potions became prototypes for modern medicine. Their genius wasn't in grand declarations, but in solving problems so thoroughly that their solutions became invisible, like the dike reeves' silent battle against the sea, or the lamplighter's nightly dance with shadows. Disappearing acts don't erase impact, they amplify it. Consider this: the parchment scraper's meticulous craft allowed ideas to outlast empires, while the siege engineer's calculations still echo in modern physics. These weren't footnotes, they were the text itself, written in sweat and ingenuity. Now turn that lens to today. The barista crafting your morning latte with the precision of a medieval spice grinder, the coders writing algorithms as cryptic as any alchemist's formula, even the delivery drivers navigating streets like Silk Road couriers. They're the unsung architects of our daily lives. Yet how many will future history books overlook? Will anyone remember the social media moderators shaping digital discourse, or the renewable energy technicians rewiring the planet? The irony is profound. We're living in someone else's future blind spot. But here's the real lesson nestled in these lost trades. Progress isn't just about the inventions we celebrate, it's about the hands that make them real. The next time you flip a light switch or board a train, pause. Someone's forgotten ancestor laid the groundwork for that convenience, just as someone we've yet to forget is building the future you'll take for granted. Legacy isn't carved in marble, it's woven into the fabric of ordinary days, waiting to be rediscovered. So as we close this chapter, let's not just honor these vanished crafts. Let's sharpen our eyes to the quiet brilliance humming all around us, right now, before it too slips into the shadows of history. From the alchemist's smoky crucibles to the Gong farmer's grim midnight rounds, these 24 forgotten professions reveal a truth that rattles the foundations of history itself. Progress was never a solo act. Every cathedral spire, every cobblestone road, every surviving manuscript exists because someone, somewhere, mastered a craft so thoroughly that their work became invisible. Think of the parchment scraper's knife-thinning animal skin until it could cradle a monk's ink, or the siege engineer calculating the exact angle to topple a fortress wall. These weren't just jobs, they were quiet acts of revolution, each one a brick in the unseeable foundation of our modern world. What's haunting is how easily their names slipped away. Kings stamped their likenesses onto coins, painters signed their altarpieces, but who carved their initials into the ropes that raised cathedral bells or the dyes that stained a queen's ceremonial robe? Their anonymity wasn't an accident, it was the price of being essential. The fuller's vats of urine cleaned wool kept armies warm. The hardtack baker's indestructible biscuits fueled voyages that redrew maps, yet their contributions were as expected as sunrise. Only when their crafts vanished did we notice the holes they left behind. But here's the beautiful paradox: their legacy outlasted empires. The stained glass artisan's understanding of light refraction lives on in your smartphone screen. The dragoman's diplomatic finesse echoes in every international treaty. Even the Leech's dubious potions laid the groundwork for clinical trials, proving that progress often wears disguises. These weren't just workers, they were the original innovators, turning limitations into breakthroughs with nothing but patience and grit. So the next time you twist open a jar of pickles or admire a medieval tapestry, pause. That tang of vinegar, it's the ghost of a saucer's preservation genius. Those vibrant threads, a dyer's color experiment surviving centuries. History didn't forget these professions, we did. And in remembering them, we do more than honor the past. We sharpen our eyes to the hidden hands shaping our present. The barista perfecting your latte foam, the technician repairing wind turbines, the gig worker navigating algorithms. They're the modern threads in the same unbroken tapestry. If this journey through the shadows of history resonated with you, share which forgotten profession surprised you most in the comments. And for more stories of the unseen architects of our world, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Until next time, keep looking closer because the most fascinating chapters of history are often hiding in plain sight.